Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Marsh, and I am the Director of Membership and Stakeholder Engagement for the Organization of American Historians. Today's webinar, Rethinking Encounters, is the first in the OAH's new multi-year project leading up to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. This project features a special 9-issue The American Historian series, with articles by leading scholars who offer fresh insights into the broad sweep of U.S. history, along with paired webinars to bring us together in conversation about our shared past as the nation approaches its semi-quincentennial milestone. Both the magazine series and webinars are free and open to the public. The U.S. History at 250 project will culminate in Philadelphia in April 2026 at the annual OAH Conference on American History. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted online next week. If you have questions during the webinar for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you need assistance, please message me or my colleague John Warner using chat. The Organization of American Historians is located on the campus of Indiana University, Bloomington. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University, Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Steve Andrews. Steve is the interim executive editor of the Journal of American History and an adjunct professor of history at Indiana University. He is also an editor at Process, a blog for American history, and is the consulting editor of The American Historian. Steve, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Beth. For the OAH, the semi-quincentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence presents an opportunity to survey the field of U.S. history. And over the next 2 years, we hope to provide a wide overview of the entire field. And an important part of this is the American Historian, our magazine. The next 9 issues of the magazine, as Beth had mentioned, will provide a chronological and thematic survey of the field. And as we enter 2026, we hope that these 9 issues, as well as the material from the JAH, from the podcast, and from our blog Process, will offer a survey of the U.S. survey, a kind of vast conversation about the field. And we hope that these conversations, this one and all of them coming together, will be retrospective, descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. And that is discussing where we've come from, where we are, where we're going, and then where we should be going. Hopefully those last 2 are the same, but they aren't always the same. So to have people think about both where the field is headed, where the field should be headed, how it can be headed in a better place moving forward. And so we hope at the end to provide a survey of the U.S. field and the discipline of history itself. So today we're here to discuss the first installment of this long project, Rethinking Encounters, and we're joined by 4 of the authors from this issue. Denise Bossy is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Florida and North American Editor-in-Chief of Ethnohistory. Her research and publications focus on the early Native South and local, public, and digital Indigenous studies. Her new book project is on the Mukamas with Dr. Keith Ashley and is being supported by a 3-year collaborative NEH grant. Alejandra Dubcovsky is a professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. She is author of Informed Power, Communication in the Early South from 2016, and Talking Back, Native Women in the Making of the Early South in 2023. Tai Edwards is a history professor and the director of the Kansas Studies Institute at Johnson County Community College in the Kansas City metro area. She is the author of numerous works, including Osage Women and Empire, Gender and Power from 2018, and has collaborated on many projects, including, and pardon my pronunciation, in Zuje Wahobe, the Sacred Red Rock to the Kaw Nation, as well as preservation of the historic Wyandot African-American and abolitionist town Quindaro in Kansas City, Kansas. And finally, Michael Witgen is a professor in the Department of History and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. He is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. Witgen studies Indigenous and early American history with a particular focus on the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley. Thank you so much all for joining us. If we could, just for those who haven't seen the issue yet, if each of you could provide just a very small sentence or two about the piece that you featured in this issue, and then we'll go to the discussion. Thank you so much. Denise?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and I'm so thrilled to be here with everyone today. My piece in the most recent Rethinking Encounters issue looks at what happens in a region that continues to celebrate colonial firsts, and I'm sandwiched between two cities that continue to do this, Jacksonville and French Fort Caroline, and St. Augustine and Spanish La Florida. And how we can begin to insert Indigenous narratives into these spaces by using digital humanities as an answer to the ongoing erasure of Indigenous people in the past and also the present.
Thanks so much, Alejandra.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and get to talk history with such wonderful people. So my piece is called Rethinking Encounters, and it really tries to think through what I call the conquistador bingo that appears in every textbook, where you have the names of the conquistadors, Coronado, De Soto, you have some biographies of them, and yet the people they encounter, the lands they traverse, seem secondary, tertiary, actually superimposed on a contemporary US national mark. So to take that premise that exists, but to think, how can we exactly rethink those moments? How can we help our students rethink it? How can we as educators rethink those moments to teach about other things beyond these handful of men marching through these lands? So that's sort of my piece.
Thanks. Tai?
My piece talks about how we've had decades now of scholarship that disproves or complicates the so-called virgin soil thesis. So we have to stop teaching and building academic arguments on the idea of wildfire epidemics or smallpox epidemics. The way I say it to my students is, it's implied that Columbus lands on Hispaniola and 20 minutes later, everyone from there to California is laying over dead. That's sarcastic, but that's sort of the image our students often have, and we have to stop teaching that. That's not what the scholarship shows, and that's not what it tells us. And we, more importantly, have to not build other arguments, academic arguments, on that false narrative.
Michael?
Hi, I'm happy to be here talking about these essays. My essay is basically an attempt to make a statement that the American experiment is and was a colonial project, that it was not a post-colonial creation of republic, but a colonial project, and that American expansion is an expansion that is a function of that colonial project of expanding into Indian territory and colonizing it. It's not a push into the wilderness that was uninhabited or lightly inhabited. And so I kind of frame this around the arrival of the first Ohio Company settlers when they show up at Marietta on a long bottom boat called the Mayflower, and sort of narrate their experiences if they were stepping off into a new world, trying to reimagine the Pilgrim experience, but extending it into what would be the Northwest Territory or Ohio country, and then try to push back against that as really the Ohio Company project is one of the first elements of America's colonial expansion into the Northwest.
I think, as I read through and saw the pieces as they were coming in and read through them all, I was really struck at how they all really hang together. And so some of these questions are so broad that they could fill the entire hour or multiple hours. So, but I mean, just in the context of even in this, so much of this work seems to be aimed at correcting, even when we introduce these pieces, are about correcting what's wrong. So what are the biggest or the multiple misconceptions that people have about this period or about Native and Indigenous history that still kind of comes up in the scholarship that you kind of deal with in your pieces? And feel free, anybody who wants to start off.
Well, I mean, I guess I can go, since the disease story is usually the first one, right? One of the first ones we tell a lot of times when we're teaching this story. I mean, I guess if your question is, why are we still doing it this way, or what's wrong with still doing it this way? I feel like there's a time in graduate school or in your college education where you read something about the virgin soil thesis and you never revisit it again after that.
Right.
And we should never do that, right? With any subject, because the whole point of our discipline is to continue to ask new questions, look at new sources, and reevaluate, right? But it's so prevalent. It's in textbooks. It's in scholarship. I see it so much in other books, right? Like in Indigenous studies, but also not in Indigenous studies. I was reading a book about terrorism in American history, and it just used, the virgin soil thesis narrative that wildfire epidemics killed people as part of the, and this isn't the case, right? Like that's not what the sources tell us anymore, and what scholars who spent decades studying this do. And so I guess my frustration is that it's very hard to displace this narrative. And you may know it came to a head in 2015 when Pope Francis came to the United States and he sainted Una Paracera in California. And there were protests, right, for months leading up to that in California, especially amongst the indigenous communities and their allies there. And part of it was because there was this whole narrative, even from official Catholic Church, but even from scholars that was saying that, disease, death isn't genocide. And that led to, all these protests. And there were even incidences in undergraduate classrooms in California at the time, conflict between indigenous students challenging their instructors, and their instructors being like, well, it couldn't be genocide. Disease doesn't have agency, right? And I feel like there were two problems when you think about that. The indigenous student should not have to be teaching their professor indigenous history in addition to all of their classmates. That's absolutely inappropriate and a colonial, sort of hierarchy manifesting right there in the classroom. But I sort of had some sympathy for this instructor, because if in graduate school they read one book and it was all about the virgin soil thesis and they had not revisited it, which all around us, many people have not, it's a natural event that can happen in that space. And so I actually thought it was a problem of historiography, maybe more than anything else. And so, I think about that when I think about where are we going? What are we doing? What should the future be? And I know it's hard for all of us to keep up, right? We all have many things to do. We don't read every book, which is why I am so grateful to OAH for having an issue like this where we can do some work of getting these narratives out there, not only for ourselves and our colleagues, but for the public, right? The public is very seduced by the narrative of germs for some of the reasons I bet we're going to talk about.
I mean, this is kind of like the idea of the disappearing Indian, right? This is the idea of that even people who want to be progressive can fall into the idea that the disease is bad, but this is just what happened. And I think Michael's work also kind of that this idea of, so one of the myths that I think still comes into people's teaching is that that the disappearance of Native Americans was somehow natural and preordained and just kind of happened. And Michael, I was struck in your piece that the virgin soil thesis still exists in 1788. I mean, we're now 400 years in of encounter and it hasn't changed.
Well, why we're still doing this is in part, I'm also kind of responding to David McCullough, who wrote a book like, The Pioneers, about the same space that I'm writing about in this piece. And, the fact that book is out there in 2018, I think, 2019, when it was published, and that a scholar who's won a Pulitzer Prize could actually reproduce a narrative where American pioneers, air quotes, are the first people to arrive in the forest of the forested Ohio country, a smattering of Indians here and there, but basically it's a narrative about settling the wilderness and replicating the original 13 colonies in the West, and how he narrates that that's the triumph. And so I was pushing back against that and trying to emphasize that the Ohio Company project, like the Northwest Ordinance that sets up the Ohio Company project and the settlement of the Northwest Territory, is an explicitly colonial project that's meant to displace Native people, and that's predicated on the idea that Americans just couldn't see indigenous people and their homelands as sovereign nations with homelands that were inviolable or should have been. Instead, they insist on imagining this as a territory that was uninhabited, even while they knew it was inhabited. And so I started out my piece with Jervis Cutler, who's the son of Manassas Cutler, who arrives in the flat bottom boat, the Pilgrim, and he jumps off the boat and starts chopping down the first tree that he finds. And and that's in the McCullough narrative, and it's just unmediated. He just writes it down. And I'm like, there's so much going on there with that. That's him performing. He's performing discovery. He's performing a first creation of the beginning of history. And so I think it was just pushing back. That's so prevalent. And even in, contemporary history with noted scholars, they perpetuate all these different myths.
Mm. Denise, I thought that one of the interesting things in your piece was that we often have like this idea of the disappearing Indian, not from only, the stories about the past, but in your piece about Fort Caroline, you actually have an act of disappearance, and you have like the person doing it. Like Florida Representative Charles Bennett actively disappears Native Americans, like as a goal, as a constructed act.
Yes, absolutely. I'm about to be very unpopular in Jacksonville because Bennett is considered like the darling of the city because he did some wonderful things, which was establish really through his own gifting as well, this amazing national park that we have. But he simultaneously ensured that that national park celebrated a first thing that he really helped to invent actively through scholarship too, imagined scholarship. And his works, his publications are still used, especially his translations of French documents, which are imperfect, are still used and still sold at the national park. And so we can see in this 1950 statute that he enacts a real problem that the park is still forced to live with today. So they do a lot of work on the ground to put Indigenous people back into the story, but they can't actually change much about the park because it's enshrined in a statute, a federal statute. And I should say Bennett also voted against the Civil Rights Act every single time. So this comes as part of a larger problem in Jacksonville in an era of really like incredible segregation in the city. So what's fascinating is that Bennett's legacy has so colored the region, and it's part of a larger firsting that still occurs across the region, right? In the 1980s, ad execs in Jacksonville named the space between Jacksonville and St. Augustine the First Coast. It's still proclaimed to be the First Coast. St. Augustine regularly has a birthday party for Pedro Menendez, the founder of St. Augustine, unproblematically with cupcakes and a huge celebration. So we're literally in a space that just continues to party about kind of colonial firsting, and in the process really erases Indigenous people in all of our local museums and sites. They just appear as sort of a backdrop, as Tai was saying. Disease sort of conveniently comes in and wipes everybody out, and then there's no discussion of them really past 1565. Even though there's incredible persistence. And so we have these two narratives in the state. One is Indigenous people, especially in sort of this First Coast, are gone by the 16th century, which of course they're not. And then the Indigenous people who are here today, the Seminoles and Miccosukees, are imagined as recent immigrants, even though they are, among their ancestors are Mocamas, Wales, Yamasees, Appalachians, Calusas, Ais, all the Indigenous people of Florida. So we are sort of sandwiched with these two really terrible narratives. And again, the park is so hamstrung that that's where digital humanities has a really important role to play, because they can add things. People can take our digital tour on site. All of the NPS folks out there are being trained to use the site too, and to sort of advertise it so that it doesn't conflict with federal law. But we also need to get this act changed. And that's something that our Indigenous community partners are really interested in helping us to do. So we're partnering with numerous Indigenous nations more and more across the Native South, who similarly are very invested at the local level. We see a lot of activism going on right now at the local level in terms of altering colonial narratives that erase Indigenous people. So the Muskogee Creek Nation in particular, very active at the local level and trying to get memorials to Indigenous pasts corrected and also installed around the South. So I think that's a fascinating moment that we're looking at.
Yeah. So as a, I mean, it's not my field, right? So but as an outside reader, some of these myths that just jumped out at me, and I'm sure like one of them was, and I thought, Alejandra, your piece did this so well, is how many of the pieces tend to see Native American peoples as apolitical, that they're not political actors. They don't have their own political dynamics. You're reading against the grain really kind of argued against that. Can you say a little bit about that process of kind of rediscovering and using, because one of the questions is what sources do we use? And you're using sources in a really interesting way for a purpose that I don't think that they were meant for.
So I think of, every time I think about this, I think of Michael Witgen. I think of Michael's work. And Michael has an introduction in his first book that has this sort of pleading to all of us that we should read against the grain, we should be critical, but we should also read these sources. I mean, and in a way, I feel like this is what a part of the silencing is. There's a colonial silence for sure. And you know, Michael, your piece, Tai, your piece as well, like showing these active silences that are very colonial making, but there's also our silencing as scholars and how we then go back and approach and think about the past, right? So there are these moments where Native people are right there in the sources. They're screaming at you. They're screaming at the colonizers, and we don't see them. We don't see them, us, not the colonial, and this is no apology to the Spanish colonials that I deal with, but there's sort of a double blinding that then goes on because we have these sources as historians, and especially historians of this long ago past as this issue began. We're bound by these documents. That's not the only sources, and none of us here on this are bound by them in any way. Working as Denise was so lovely, working with contemporary communities, taking that very seriously, listening to their calls. And we have these records, these 16th, 17th century records that are available to us, and they're complicated and they're layered, but they are riddled with Indigenous people telling us their story. And there's a way in which we are so seduced by the narratives, especially the early narratives, because they're exactly that, right? They're travel stories and they're taking us from A to B and we're following them along. And so they're incredibly seductive because they're also trying to describe, and they're also desperately trying to make sense of a region, right? So you see them like, what is this? What is that? What is that? Can we eat that? Right? So they're constantly having these anxieties. And so we follow them, and we follow their anxieties and concerns without pausing for even a little bit. So it is reading against the grain, but it's also pausing, and it's a very low bar to have to clear, but affording all the actors that they meet the same level of humanity that we're affording these Europeans. And that is a low bar that in 2024 I'm asking us to clear, but it becomes very telling once we imagine the Indigenous people that the Europeans are meeting as fully fledged people with political desires, economic desires, with all sorts of things in between, then the actions become much more interesting than just, oh, they met someone. You begin to ask, why were they there? How did they get there? How did this woman walk from one town to the other without being stopped? And there are reasons for that that are not just in our imagination, so we can begin to piece apart. So I think I as a person who loves doing archival work and loves thinking through these sources, I think there's a lot there that we can not just reread, but like read with care and ask as teachers, ask our students to think about these people as actors and not just as on the receiving end of Spanish movement or French movement or English movement later on, but as actors in their own right.
Yeah, I mean, that sense that these pieces seem to be pushing against is this idea that Native and Indigenous groups are static, that they are once they're the same across the Southwest to the Northeast, and that they're somehow Native groups are all one thing, and that they don't change. I mean, I thought your piece is like, and you don't want to be glib, but so many of the presentations are the disease arrives and Natives simply either die or wait to die, as if these aren't all societies in motion encountering Europeans and other Native groups and disease and factors and moving into motion.
Right. So one of the things, I titled the piece Disruption, Then Disease. And, people always tell you never to put too much accenting, but I was like, I want it bolded. I want the then underlined. I want it italicized. I really want to make a point even with the text that it's disruption, then disease, which with my students, I can get them to do in their notes, in the way we talk about it. But I think, and even Alejandra, you just said seduced, right? Like not only are historians, but like the public, we are seduced by these ideas of simplicity, even though nothing in our own lived experience lends itself to simplicity. And so I don't know why we would ever think the past is equally simplistic. But I think this goes back to what Michael was talking about. I think that there is not only colonial agendas in analyzing disease at the moment that it happens, even though, as Alejandra says, when you read the sources, though, you get all the information you need to see that even someone with an agenda isn't right, like, because of what they inevitably end up telling you. But that colonial agenda persists in our understandings to the present, right? And there's lots of scholars, and I cite some of them in the piece in this volume. Is why do we believe things about Indigenous people in colonization of the Americas that we don't believe for any other peoples in any other time and place, right? Like, the only reason is colonial hierarchy and racism, right? So we have to start challenging that. And I do have to say that, like, one of the things that is exciting. So, of course, I'm a non-native scholar, but a lot of the people that are pushing this are Indigenous scholars who are saying, this is not the story my family has ever told, right? My community has always believed in things that absolutely contradict this, right? And so as our field finally embraces many more people to practice, we have more people that can not only criticize the sources or evaluate the sources in ways that are much more productive, but we can finally let go of some of these myths that even hamper, practicing historians that are doing this work. And, we have to, sometimes I wonder if we have to stop saying even Indigenous peoples and Native Americans. I mean, we have to be nation specific to help our students conceive, right, of the peoples of the Americas. And it's not just in the past, it's in the present too, as sovereign peoples of different communities. And I will say, like, I'm in a state that has 4 resident tribal nations to the present. So getting the past wrong isn't just about getting the past wrong. It means the people that are in our elected government positions and our other important roles in our communities do not even have the conception of Indigenous people as people in tribal governments and tribal nations, and are ill-prepared to engage in that reality in the present. So doing this disservice in the past has absolute implications in our present.
I mean, I think as historians in other fields, we would never necessarily say, well, German, French, Italians, they're all the same. They're essentially, we can draw very clear designations in time. The 1960s are nothing like the 1930s, but assume that a group that we describe as native is essentially the same from 1600 to 1800, and they're all the same across this vast region, for sure, right? Are there other myths that as people who are, again, many of our listeners and readers are going to be educators, that educators need to try to be more aware of as they're scheduling their own things? Like, the idea of static, or the disease kind of has this massive effect, and that it's apolitical, and that there's not cultural differences and political differences. And I think really, as you said, that these are full-fledged people who have a full panoply of emotions and motivations. Are there other ones that off the top that we should talk about? Yeah.
I would love to jump in. I think it comes across really in both the work I'm doing and Michael's work too, is territorial sovereignty. And that's something that we still see. I give a lot of public talks. A year ago, I had someone raise their hand, and I was doing Yamasee territorial sovereignty. And she said, I thought Indians didn't own land. And I said, thank you so much for that question, right? Because there's still, I think we can be quite removed from it as scholars, but it's still very pervasive. So one of the things I always do when I talk about the French at Fort Caroline is I use several quotes from them saying we are in Satyriwa's territory. And I show a map of Mocama, and I show right where we think Fort Caroline was. And I show that it's in the middle of Mocama homelands. And then I talk about how the French weren't there because they wanted to be there. They were there because the Mocamas allowed them briefly to be there. And in turn, the French colony failed when they violated the terms of their treaty alliance with the Mocamas, and they essentially starved them out of the region. And that is very transformative. And I think we need to talk more about territorial sovereignty. And I do see as editor of ethnohistory, a lot of works coming in that are really making that claim. I mean, we have a lot of already good published work, but I think this is really something that younger scholars are doing a lot of work on right now, is different regions and how territorial sovereignty is expressed in many different ways within different discrete indigenous nations. And I'd love to hear Michael talk about this too.
Yeah, I would love to follow up. This is, I think, the thing that has been in my face recently in terms of teaching it and putting the word out there, which is indigenous territorial sovereignty, but also just pushing back against this narrative that American expansion happened as America expanded into an unsettled wilderness. That is still the trope that people have. And let's think about Indiana, where the OH is located, outside of Vincennes, which was a sort of French hybrid colonial town. The entire state of Indiana is created through a treaty process that first forces Native people to cede title to their land, which they didn't want to do, and then puts that land in a public domain. And then that land, it enters the public domain. Often it sits there for long periods of time because they often push treaties in advance of demand, especially in the upper Midwest. Indiana fills in rapidly, but those treaties that are negotiated with the Indiana tribes are usually for like tens of millions of acres for cents on the dollar. And that then gets put into the public domain and sold by the US government like at $1 an acre. So they're making a huge amount of price. And so that still at $1 an acre is way less than that land gets resold as it passes from hand to hand, because the original buyers often sold it again. And so I guess part of the point is that the federal government was subsidizing land ownership, home ownership for white people. That's how the Midwest gets settled. That's how the West gets settled with the Homestead Act. These are acts that are meant to take Indian land, transfer it into a public domain, and then sell it to white settlers at a discounted rate. And so the entire the kind of private stock of American home ownership, homesteads in the West, are fashioned from Indian land, and you couldn't have had one but for the other. And then you compound that with public universities that are created through the Morrill Act. Land grant universities that are created from Indian land was turned into a financial instrument and then given to the states to sell that instrument and create universities. The Railroad Act, which did a similar thing to create land bonds from Indian land to pay for railroads. But all these things are ways in which Indian land, the wealth of Indian people, is sort of repurposed by the Republic of the United States in order to finance its growth and development for a largely white citizenship base. And just to can acknowledge that this is a transfer of land and wealth from indigenous people to Americans. We're all benefiting from that, myself included. We're all benefiting from this process. And so you don't have to make everybody run home feeling guilty, with the whole woke politics, but we need to understand and acknowledge that this is how America was created. And we have a responsibility to this history and to the indigenous people who managed to survive in the wake of this massive dispossession. So pushing back against that narrative that this was a sort of natural process, that we moved into a wilderness, and the gumption of pioneers is what really settled the states of America. It wasn't. It was a federally it was a federal process that took Indian land, converted it into money and resources for its citizens, and then used that to capitalize this development. And so put it in that framework instead of a wilderness. Make sure that we recognize that we owe this debt back to Native people, and that the Native people who are on reservations, they often quite poor communities, would not be poor if they had been able to maintain their wealth that they had in land. If Redcliffe, where I'm from, which ceded something like 13 million acres in 1837 at 7 cents an acre, most of which sat there for over 20 and 30 years because it was in northern Wisconsin. And in 1837, people aren't really dying to settle in northern Wisconsin, and eventually gets sold to people doing mining and timber. But if Redcliffe could have held on to that land for the century, for the decades before it became valuable, and then sold it themselves, then we would be really, really wealthy, instead of having entered into the 20th century pretty much destitute because you were forced to sell land that was your main asset.
Well, and just to underscore, these are developed lands already, right? So that something Michael's been saying, this notion of wilderness, these are already developed lands. There's a fascinating plat from 1701 that I've done a lot of work on that shows a colonial settler moving into spaces that the Yamasees have recently left, and sort of skipping a process because those lands are already developed. So they're moving into lands that have already been developed by indigenous people, right? It's not a wilderness by any means. So it's the land, but it's also the development of that land, agricultural fields, homesteads, all sorts of spaces that have already been cleared and nurtured in all sorts of ways that are also intrinsically valuable. And so they're capitalizing on indigenous real estate development as well.
Can I ask, some of these are like, so for people who are doing this kind of history, it might not be their focus. And we wrestled with this when we were titling the issue. What is the way, I mean, there have been various ways to describe this that we feel that we have left behind. Age of exploration, discovery. Is encounters the best, or is there a better term that comes out that better captures this period of what's going on in Native and Indigenous history? Is that acceptable? I mean, I hope it's acceptable because we used it, but are there better terms out there, and what's at stake in what we call these things?
I'll jump in and say, when I was reached out to do this, I followed up because I had questions about what you all meant by encounters.
Sure.
And I have to admit that was one of the most hilarious Zoom conversations, because at one point I was like, oh, you and I don't think about encounters at all in the same way. Like at one point, like the Puritans got mentioned, and I was like, in encounters? Like, where are we temporally? So it opened up a great conversation about, and I think one of the other myths that I want to point out is how long this history is. Like how, like the stories that I told in that piece are from the early 1500s, but there's earlier stories and so really Indigenous history is extraordinarily long. So honing it in, putting it into these national frameworks is really important, because we're living with the repercussions today. So I don't want to sort of say, no, it doesn't fit into this paradigm, or Indigenous history doesn't have anything to add to it. It absolutely does. But there's a way in which it also doesn't, right? Because it's much longer. It takes us to a different moment in time. And I think encounters, one of the things it does, right, it marks a moment, right, when Europeans enter the picture, and things are going to begin to shift, especially for the communities along the coastal areas that are being impacted. Absolutely. That being said, right, it still has us following these Europeans this way, and it does tell a story that tends to move from, the East Coast that way. My students, when I teach the survey in California, are like, are you going to get to California? Where are we if we tell this story from this coast to that coast and the like? And where are Indigenous people that are not encountering Europeans in that directionality well? So I think encounters is as good a phrase as any, but I think of sort of moments of collision. I mean, any term that you throw has positive and negative association to it. I think one of the problems of encounter, but that's true of any other ones, is that it's sort of who's encountering who at what time. And it also means that a lot of these groups are also encountering each other as Europeans are pushing across these borders, and Native people are not meeting each other for the first time, but forcing to interact with each other in new ways. So I think when we think about these early moments of encounter, it's between Europeans and Indigenous people, between Indigenous people and Indigenous people. Oftentimes, Europeans learn about each other through Native people, right? So they're learning about what the French are doing or what the English are doing through the networks and interactions of Indigenous people. So, and encounters, I think, is good because they're all meeting each other, but it also sort of, if we are not just telling the story from one directionality.
Yeah, when I first heard that you wanted to use encounters, I was like, I object. So, for lots of reasons. But if I use Alejandra's lead-in, when we think about disease, right, that's one of the myths, is like that it's a quick encounter, right? And the whole thing that I write about, and again, surveying many different people's scholarship, right, that has dealt with this and analyzed this, is it takes decades and sometimes centuries before engagement with, like with intermarriage, right, and living with and in trading with and engagement with Europeans and others who come to the Americas, especially North America, because, and this is why I titled the piece this way, right? Disruption, then disease. Indigenous people are not vulnerable to epidemic disease until their lives have been significantly disrupted by colonialism in some other way. And in some cases, these ways are, right, hugely transformative, right? Which might involve, right, forced missionization concentration, right? Which changes what you eat, where you live, how you practice your culture and your religion, right? Using people's labor for the benefit of the Spanish rather than for the benefit of the home community. One of the examples I use is for the Osage in Kansas. I mean, when settlers are literally stealing your horses, living in your house, grazing their livestock in your fields, that's going to impact your health, right? And it's not until after those things happen that you see disease. So back to this idea that Alejandra said with Encounter sort of implies briefness, right? Like it seems quick. But the experience of disease has this much longer context of what are colonizers doing in their engagement with with a particular indigenous community over the years and decades that precede it, and how has that undermined indigenous life. And it's hard for me to not feel like all of this is colonialism, right? Because the agenda, and this is what you were saying, Michael, right? The agenda that these newcomers are bringing is a colonial agenda. And if we're talking about the British and Americans especially, it's a settler colonial agenda, which means they plan to stay, right? And the way they plan to stay is that indigenous populations cannot stay, right? And so there's consequences there.
Yeah, I would jump in and say encounters is fine. If I were to come up with another word, I would say colonialism. But and as Alejandra was saying, it kind of depends on at what point are you encountering people. And de Tocqueville, when he's touring America to write, on democracy, says, I've got to go see the wilderness and Indians before they disappear. So he goes to Michigan and he goes to the land office and he says, where's your least settled place? And they send him on his way, and he gets a guide because he's going to Saginaw Village and he can't get there on his own. So he hires who to get him there? An Indian. So the Indians take him to the woods. He encounters other Indians on the way. And then he shows up at the Saginaw and he has to take a ferry across the bay. When the ferry person comes across, the ferry person addresses him in French saying, be careful with your horse. And he says, I would have been less surprised if my horse talked to me. Because it was a native person who was engaging him in French. And he was just dumbfounded by this. And then he goes on to continue narrating this experience as if these people are encountering the modernity in the world for the first time, blowing right past the fact that all these native people are speaking French to him, his own language. So clearly they had a first encounter sometime in the centuries past. And yet, that's how he's narrating this. This is the last unbroken place of Indianness, not a place that's already been dealing with the global market economy, colonies, empires, missionaries, etc., for over a century. So, at what point does the encounter start? I think American history programs often sort of privilege it when the Americans arrive. In a broader context, it might be when the colonists arrive. But I don't know. It's encounters is fine, but I would vote with Tai and say we could also call it colonialism.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, is that okay if I also agree with colonialism? I think something that Alejandra is beginning to tap into is really important too, which is encounters are not new, right? In the 15th and 16th centuries for indigenous people. And if we use an indigenous chronology to situate, for example, the French in a Mocama world or the Spanish, in an Appalachian world, what we see instead is a very long history of religious encounters, population movements, whole regions. For example, the Savannah River by 1450, the lower middle parts of the Savannah River by 1450 being empty, we think of humans because they've moved because of major climatic changes in the area, but also really important political changes in the area too that have persuaded Savannah River folks to move both to the coast and to the interior and all sorts of different places. So we're looking at communities, at nations that have very deep, rich histories of coalescence, ethnogenesis, population movement, religious encounters, religious transformations that come all well before and expansive networks that come all well before colonialism. And so we have to use archaeology to situate really these encounters with colonists in these much longer histories of encounters. For example, in our region, there's this notion that the Franciscans introduced the idea of religious change to indigenous people, and that's absolutely ludicrous. That's been going on for centuries. We have direct contact between the Jacksonville area and Cahokia around 1100 Common Era. And there are surely dramatic religious conversations going on as a result. So we have to situate all of this in a much bigger, broader, deeper indigenous chronology and geography. And so rethinking encounters might also mean rethinking that these encounters are new in some ways and also very not new in other ways, and parsing that out very carefully.
One more question, then I think we have a couple of audience questions to go to and I think it's come up in this conversation in the last answer, which is if someone is approaching and incorporating and wants to do better in their classroom that's not necessarily dedicated to Native and Indigenous history, where do they start? Because there's an argument here that you start with right? I mean, are we starting with Jeffers petroglyphs? Do you start, because if you start the story, because it seems from reading this issue, it really struck me strong that if you start the story in 1770 or 1607, you are starting the story not in the middle of the native and indigenous story, but very far. There's a long history beforehand. But the question is, as educators who are not necessarily teaching a class dedicated to this, where do you start? And are there snapshots you can take that's a responsible way to do it? Is that irresponsible? Like, what are the moments where, I think there's some people who think that they're really doing well by starting in 1492 or starting in central Mexico in the 1510s. But even that, if you start, are you starting so far in a story in medias res that you're not, what are you missing when you start at those different time periods?
So you asked about time period, but I would make a pitch to start with local Indigenous history. Instead of thinking that you have to do everything. I would make a pitch for K through 12 in particular to start with some local Indigenous history and thinking about connecting students to that place and making it not only about the past, but also the present. And I think that's a really big service that teachers can do, whether it's K through 12 or college, that's a sort of a hard ask, but in some ways an easier ask. Students really connect, I think, to local spaces. And so making it about that might be a way to begin.
I 100% agree. I was going to say the exact same thing. Start with where you are. I know in Kansas we're doing, I'm part of an effort, it's Indigenous led, and it's working with tribal governments in the state, but then also historic tribes of Kansas, many forced to leave or some that were temporarily relocated here, because we were Indian territory for a while. But there's this whole effort across the state of providing new resources to teachers of all levels to help them do exactly what you're talking about. And I think the more you can start with where you are, the better. It gives it some concentration. I live in a state that's named for an Indigenous nation that was expelled from the state that bears their name. This is their homeland, and they are, their tribal headquarters is in another state. And so I think starting where you are is easier for an instructor. And it also, I hate the phrase, there's so much history in this place. There's the same amount of history in all places. And I hate when people use that phrase. And I think it's really important for us to teach our students, especially if your students are, at K through 12 level, right? They live in that place, maybe for their whole life, maybe they were born there. But to give them a sense of the long-term human occupation and use and stewardship of that place, I think is very valuable.
We have a couple questions. I think one of them, Michael, might be working off of yours of what do you do with the Articles of Confederation and its schizophrenia of making the governors of the territories both defenders of Native American rights and responsible for encouraging more settlement in the Old Northwest, as it was then called? Is that an angle that's a complication that you've run across in your work?
Not really. By the time the Northwest Ordinance is in place, that's when the new Constitution has replaced the Articles of Confederation. But the articles do task the governors with negotiating with Native people to extinguish land from time to time. So yeah, they're definitely the territorial governors are federal appointees, and they were definitely tasked with expanding the state. The Northwest Ordinance both says we won't take land from Indians, but also if they want to sell it, they have to sell it to the state and only the state. I think that there's a presumption that they're going to keep expanding, so they're actively participating in that from the get-go. So I think everybody expects that they will be entering into more negotiations. They will be engaged with the treaty process. The Indians are going to essentially just keep ceding land, either moving away or becoming assimilated or vanishing mysteriously. There's some combination, but yeah, governors are always imagined as being part of that.
Another question, I'm curious whether any of the panelists use or incorporate Caroline Dodd Pinnock's work on Indigenous peoples' reactions to and activities in Europe when they were taken there or traveled there. I love her title, quote, On Savage Shores, and savage refers to Europeans. Does that work, or that those issues of the reverse of Native American encounters with Europe, is that something that figures in any of your work?
I think this gets to your question, Steve, about sort of where we start and where we begin and how we do our focus. So I'm gonna sort of try to pivot and answer it in
Sure.
that way, because I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's a wrong place to start the U.S. survey and a right place. And Denise and Tai's suggestions to start local is a fantastic one. But I think about that in the 4th grade, and then I think we get to the 5th grade, and then it's like, okay, forget the local. Now we have to tell the U.S. history story, and then we do that again in the 8th grade and 11th grade, and it doesn't really matter where you are or that. So I think part of it is to try to make those connections, right, of where you start. So it doesn't matter if you're going to begin in Europe or you're going to begin there, but to think about the whatever moment of encounter. So I think less about precisely where or what anecdote. And I think Michael's story that, he's taking us in the moment of like the rise of the American Republic. And usually this is narrated without Indigenous people and without the incredible economic profit this government is, making through this land. And I think that's it, right? Is thinking where Indigenous people and stories and voices come into the narratives you are telling. So you can begin, with Columbus, you can begin in these, but I think there's so much even to read the sources. And I think it's one of those things, even when you read the most sort of colonial moment of Columbus's journal, it's filled with what Native people are doing and how they're responding to him. So I think even if you don't know how to interact or read the sources, but to think to yourself, okay, this is what Columbus says, what do Native people do in these spaces? And I think this is the interactions with them in Europe help really unsettle these moments of Native people are in these spaces, in these courts, informing and telling the monarchs about what's happening in this world. And I think that is so critical. They're so incredible and unexpected places for us, but the reality is they're in all these moments and stories, and asking ourselves as educators, where are they and what do they offer? What counterbalance or what additional force is that? And I think there's so much scaredness to do this perfectly or to do this right, that then the excuse is, well, I can't do it all, right? So I won't do it. And I think that's honestly a little bit more dangerous than not trying even a little bit, because then we end up with these celebratory stories that just ignore on the people, as Denise was starting us out with.
Right. Yeah, so there is that kind of idea there that Native Americans, in some ways it's like American religion, right? We have this First Great Awakening, very important. Puritans love, very important with the religion. Second Great Awakening. And then in most survey classes, we're not going to talk about religion again until the 1970s. Like, evidently, America's not religious anymore. But as Denise says, that early on in Florida history, the Native Americans are disappearing. Like, they're there for Seminole Wars. And then occasionally they will come up. But for the period between the 1815 and 1880s, no Native Americans in the 1880s, and then they may never show up until Red Power, if that. How do we as educators, is it just as simple as saying just turn and see that they are always there and as part of the story, or are there other ways in which you can bring the Native American voices or Native American experience into that longer sweep of American history after this encounter moment?
Well, this is probably Michael's subject matter, but I have to say, like, when I'm teaching the survey, especially the first half, if your institution breaks them up into two, the entire first half and well into the second half, basically every economic period, and certainly after every panic, is funded and stimulated by Indigenous resources and wealth. I don't know how else you can teach that. That's what's happening, right? The way I teach the Spanish-American War is that's the moment where they have to decide, are we going to colonize elsewhere because we've colonized everyone here? And they decide we're going to do it elsewhere, right? I will say, if you're at a level where you can teach colonialism in any detail, you do a great service to your students, because the more students understand U.S. colonialism, the more they will understand many aspects of the world that they're living in. And the whole purpose of what we're doing is to help students make sense of their lives. my students, by the time I get to the War on Terror, are ready to understand the context of that conflict because we have done all this work, right? If you're doing the war in Vietnam and the Cold War, you are ready to understand that if I've set it up with these other aspects of American colonialism before. And so I think that's one of the things is the better handle you can get on this particular subject, because it is so embedded in everything that Americans do. And even in terms of foreign policy, right, and domestic policy, et cetera, the more you can get a handle on this, the easier it will be to teach many of the other subjects you have to teach.
Yeah, I would agree. If you're teaching the survey post-revolution, the expansion of the republic occurs through its interaction with Native people, through both treaties and even if you want to teach colonialism, you have this sort of continuum of sort of settler colonialism that you see with Indian removal, and this sort of outright colonialism that you see in the upper Midwest, where tribes say, no, we won't move away, and they're effectively colonial subjects within a state. Either way, it's the resources that are coming from Indian people that are facilitating expansion with the cotton growing South. Obviously, those economic dynamics are easy to explain, but it's also about dispossession. But then when you look at places like Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, and those states are also developing in large part by this transfer of wealth, not just landed wealth, but when you transfer the landed wealth, you have to facilitate that. There's a treaty process, an annuity process. The annuities are payments, cash payments. All the big territorial merchants and state officials are claiming those cash payments for themselves as debt, or they're merchants who are supplying the merchandise portion of the annuity payment. So they're selling to the federal government. So everybody's making cash or taking cash from this engagement with Native people, from the process of stripping of their land and turning it into private property. All that stuff is where the money is being made. The capital development of Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, all comes through engagement with Native people. So you can teach that by teaching the treaties, teaching issues that are linked with the expansion west. The slavery in the color line that also gets adjudicated. What do you do with mixed race Indians? What do you do with Indians? Can they vote? Can they not vote? So all these issues go, and then once you get to the Civil War part of the end of that first half of the survey, and we have to get them to get their heads around the fact that people like the Cherokee fight for the Confederates because they own slaves. So there's tons of stuff you can do to keep engaging Native history while still doing the survey and showing how, in fact, integral to American history their engagement with Indians are. When you go into the state capitol, which is rebuilt after its destruction in the War of 1812, the original artwork are these bas relief mirrors that tell the mythology of America. Every single one of those relief panels is a story about Americans and Indians. So the citizens of the Republic at the time that they had become independent understood that their identity was intertwined with the identity of Native North America. And if you want to teach an accurate history, it would represent that they understood their history is unfolding simultaneous with Indian history.
I don't know that there's a better landing point to have landed it literally at 4:59, Michael, than to have ended on exactly that answer. I think that sounded perfect. But I want to give everybody, thank you guys so much for are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to throw in as we move forward? And that last one is tough to follow. I'm not I'm not doing a good job to follow it right now, but thank you guys so much. Thank you for all your work on the issue. Thank you for the pieces that you've put into it. I really do think that they hang together remarkably well and open into all of these ways. And I think that they're very usable for classrooms at every level and for anyone who is interested in what's going on in Native and Indigenous history. It works as a great primer to get you started. So thank you so much for all of your work, and thank you for dedicating your time and expertise to the OAH.
Yes, thank you, everybody. For those of our attendees who haven't had a chance to explore the issue yet, it is available on our website at oah.org, and the recording from this webinar will be available on the same website next week. Thank you again, and this was a great conversation. We appreciate you all being here. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.